Have you ever walked into a crowded diner and noticed an old man sitting alone in the corner, his food untouched, his eyes distant, a faded tattoo barely visible beneath his sleeve, and wondered, who is he? What if I told you that this quiet man, overlooked and dismissed by everyone around him, once carried a nation's weight on a shattered leg, and a silent promise in his heart? This is not just a story about war or honor or loss. This is the story of what happens when the world forgets and one young soldier remembers. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you won't look at silence the same way ever again. Under the soft golden hue of a Kentucky Sunday morning, the Maplewood Diner bustled with the usual hum of clinking forks, casual laughter, and the scent of brewed coffee and sizzling eggs. It was Veterans Discount Day, the kind of occasion that drew families, elderly men with stories folded deep into their wrinkles, and sometimes those no one remembered, but who had given more than most. In the far left corner of the diner, nearly hidden from view, sat an old man in a faded charcoal jacket. His name, though no one asked, was Martin Cole. His shoulders sloped with time, his eyes carried a silence that most mistook for absence, and his left leg metal from the knee down clicked softly when he moved. But today he was not moving, not yet. In front of him sat a tray with a basic breakfast eggs toast, a side of hash browns cooling faster than the sunlight creeping across the diner floor, a single glass of water, no ice. He stared at the food without urgency. On his left wrist, barely visible under the rolled-up sleeve of his worn jacket, was a tattoo. It was no ordinary ink. A broken dagger crossed a fractured anchor, the edges blurred by age and sun, but still distinct enough to catch the attention of those who knew what they were seeing, or thought they knew. At the center table sat a group of men in their mid-40s, overdressed for a breakfast crowd, collars stiff and voices louder than necessary. One of them, stocky with a baseball cap, turned backward, nudged his friend with a grin. "Hey, check out old Captain America over there. Look at that tattoo. Bet he got it in a bar in Tijuana." He chuckled, not lowering his voice. Another chimed in. Probably one of those guys who pretends to be military to get free meals. No vet ID, no uniform, just old stories and sad eyes. The others laughed. Their plates were full, their arrogance fuller. Martin heard them, of course. He heard everything. The mockery wasn't new. In fact, it was almost tradition by now. Every year on this date, he walked into a different diner in a different part of town, always alone, always quiet, always carrying the same hope that maybe the world hadn't forgotten entirely. But each time it was the same. The suspicious glances, the uncomfortable shifting of eyes, the quiet requests to move elsewhere, and the worst, the laughter. As Martin gently lifted a fork to begin eating, a young waitress in a blue apron approached. She looked barely 20. Nervous, her voice gentle but apologetic. "Sir, I'm really sorry, but someone asked if you could maybe eat outside. They said you're making people feel uncomfortable." Her voice dropped near the end, ashamed of the words she was being told to speak. Martin didn't look up. He simply nodded. No anger, no reply. Just a slow, careful gathering of his tray. He stood, his right hand steadying the metal cane that clicked softly against the tile floor. As he limped past the middle table, one of the men leaned back, smirking. "If that guy's a SEAL, I'm the Secretary of Defense." The table erupted in laughter again. A child standing in line tugged on his father's shirt and whispered, "Daddy, why does that man walk funny?" The father, without even glancing over, replied dismissively, "Just a homeless guy, sweetie, ignore him." A single tear slid down Martin's cheek, tracing the weathered lines of his face before dropping silently to the diner floor. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't stop. The manager behind the counter watched it all unfold, hands frozen mid-polish on a coffee pot, but after a second's hesitation, turned away. Martin exited through the glass door, the bell above chiming weakly as if unsure whether it should mark his leaving. Outside, the sun glared brighter, forcing him to squint. The patio was nearly empty. No one preferred to eat in the glaring heat when the air-conditioned comfort inside awaited. But for Martin, it was nothing new. He scanned the outdoor tables and selected one in the farthest corner, as isolated as the one he had just left. He sat slowly, the metal chair creaking under the combined weight of age and memory. The eggs had gone cold, the toast stiff, but still he lifted his fork with quiet dignity. This wasn't about the food. It never had been. The Maplewood Diner for most was just another small-town eatery with decent prices and fast service. For Martin, it was sacred ground. 52 years ago in the mud-soaked forests along the Cambodian border, a promise had been made. His best friend, Daniel Myers, the loudest and most loyal soul in Seal Echo, had carried a wrinkled photo of this very diner in his breast pocket. When we make it back, first burgers on me, he'd grinned the night before their final mission. But they hadn't both made it back. Daniel's body had never even returned home. Martin, on the other hand, had been thrown 30 feet by the explosion, his left leg shredded by shrapnel and earth. When he came to, his first thought had been of Daniel. His second of the coordinates they still hadn't relayed. With a shattered radio and a team bleeding out around him, Martin had used only hand-drawn maps, terrain memory, and stubborn survival to direct the medevac chopper to the clearing they had marked the night before. He never spoke of it, never asked for medals. He only kept a folded letter from his commanding officer in his wallet, ink faded but words sharp. "To the quietest soldier I've ever commanded, thank you." And he came to this diner every year on this date, not for the discount, not for the meal, but to sit in silence and honor a promise that only he remembered. Inside the diner, the group of men had returned to their food, the incident already forgotten. But near the entrance, just stepping in, was a figure in black boots and civilian clothes hair, cropped short in military regulation. His name was Logan Pierce, a 26-year-old Navy SEAL, home on leave. His gait was smooth, his eyes alert, and as he moved toward the counter, he caught sight of something through the window. His steps froze. Outside, barely visible behind the glare on the glass, sat an old man alone. His tray untouched, a faded tattoo visible on his wrist. The image struck Logan like a blast of cold air. That tattoo, it wasn't regulation. It wasn't official Navy. But it was legend. In SEAL training, there were whispers of a small unit, Echo 6, whose members designed their own mark, a dagger, through a broken anchor, earned not with ink, but with blood. "Excuse me," Logan muttered, pushing past a waitress. He burst out the door and approached the table, his heart racing. "Sir, were you with SEAL Team?" Echo Martin looked up, startled by the sudden presence. His eyes met Logan's, and for a long second, he didn't speak. Then quietly, "A long time ago?" "Yes." Logan stood to attention. Right there in the summer heat of the patio, in front of empty chairs and half-eaten food, he saluted. "Sir, you're Cole Echo 6, the one from Operation Iron Lake. You're the one they tell us about." Martin's hand trembled slightly as he set down his fork. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the distant murmur of the diners inside. Logan turned to the door. "This restaurant has no right to ask you to leave. If anyone here is uncomfortable in your presence, it is they who should go." And then louder, as he stepped inside again. "Ladies and gentlemen, outside sits a man who carried 5 wounded soldiers through enemy fire and coordinated extractions still taught in our academy today. If you can't eat in the presence of a legend, you don't deserve to be here." Silence. The entire diner froze. The manager's face went pale. A woman stood and clapped. Then another. Then the room erupted not in noise, but in reverent, awe-filled stillness. Martin, watching through the glass, saw faces change. And though he didn't want special attention, something inside him softened. He had been seen. After half a century of silence, someone remembered. That for today was enough. The air shifted the moment Martin Cole stepped back into the diner, not because he intended to return, but because Logan Pierce had insisted on it, quietly placing a firm hand on the old man's shoulder and saying with a conviction that allowed no argument, "Please, sir, come back inside. This isn't how today should go." And so, with slow, uneven steps, Martin allowed himself to be guided back through the doorway he had just been cast out of. The bell above the entrance chimed again, but this time it was not weak, it rang with purpose. Inside, the entire diner had changed. Those who moments earlier laughed or stared now found their mouths sealed, their eyes uncertain. The manager, red-faced, clutching a rag that trembled in his fingers, approached with stammering words. "Mr. Cole, sir, we deeply regret the misunderstanding. Your meal is of course on the house, and we would be honored if you would join us inside. Please, any table you want." Martin looked around not for approval, but for peace. He didn't want attention. Never had. "I don't need special treatment," he said, voice low, hoarse, but even. "I just came to remember a friend." Logan, standing beside him, nodded with quiet pride. "Then, let's honor him properly." And together they walked toward the table that had been cleared right at the front under the main window, where light streamed in warmly as if blessing the moment. A waitress, young brunette, her apron slightly stained with syrup, hurried over with a fresh cup of coffee, setting it down gently in front of Martin. "I'm so sorry about earlier," she said, voice shaking. "My grandfather, he served too. Vietnam. Never talked about it. I think he saw things no one should see." Martin raised his eyes to meet hers. There was something familiar there, not just in the words, but in the way her hands trembled as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "What was his name?" Martin asked softly. "Daniel," she said, blinking. "Daniel Myers." The room felt as though it had frozen in that instant. Martin's hand reached slow and unsure into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a yellowed photograph. The edges curled, the colors faded to sepia tones. In the image, two young men grinning, dust-covered, sunburned, stood shoulder to shoulder in a muddy field, rifles slung over their backs. "He promised me a burger here," Martin whispered. 50 years ago." The girl's hand flew to her mouth. Tears pooled in her eyes. "He was my grandfather." She choked. He never made it home. My mom, she never got to meet him." Martin nodded, emotion welling in his throat like a dam on the verge of breaking. "He was the best of us. He gave everything." Around them, a hush fell again, not of shame now, but of reverence. People weren't just watching a veteran anymore. They were witnessing the reconnection of generations severed by war and silence. Logan remained nearby, standing as if on silent duty, his presence anchoring the moment. A woman at the bar dabbed her eyes with a napkin. An elderly man in the corner, once hunched in cynicism, now stood hat over his heart. And in the silence, a new sound rose, the scraping of chairs as people began to rise. Not all at once, but gradually, row by row, gesture by gesture, until the entire diner stood. Not applauding, not cheering, just standing, in respect, in apology, in awe. Later that afternoon, someone posted a photo to social media, Martin sitting at the window, Logan standing behind him, the waitress Sarah Myers clutching the photograph to her chest. The caption read, "The salute that changed our town." The image went viral within hours. Thousands of shares, millions of views. News outlets picked up the story. Veterans groups from all over the country began calling the diner. Letters arrived, cards, handmade drawings from school children, and the tattoo. The dagger through the broken anchor became a symbol. Local artists painted it onto a mural downtown. A plaque was commissioned for the diner's front wall, reading, "Here sat a man who remembered when the world forgot." Logan, meanwhile, returned to base, but something had shifted in him too. That evening he wrote a letter to his commanding officer, detailing what had happened, not to elevate himself, but to suggest that the legacy of Martin Cole and Echo 6 should be formally recognized. "We walk in the footsteps of men like him," he wrote, "but most of us never stop to look at those footsteps. That ends now." The response came back swiftly. Approval, commendation. Martin was invited reluctantly, humbly, to visit a naval training facility in Virginia, where young SEALs were now learning tactics based on his original extraction plans. He refused the travel offer 3 times. "I'm no one special," he'd say. "I just did my job." But finally, on the 4th letter, handwritten by Logan himself, he agreed. "If it means Daniel's name will be remembered too, then I'll come." The day he arrived at the facility, he was met not with brass bands or banners, but with a line of recruits standing at attention, their eyes sharp, their boots polished, their faces filled with something beyond respect, reverence. Logan stood at the front, saluted and said simply, "This is the man behind the methods." Martin spent the afternoon answering questions, deflecting praise, and finally walking to the wall of remembrance where Daniel Myers' name had just been etched next to the others who hadn't come home. He didn't cry, not visibly, but Logan saw the way his fingers lingered on the carved letters, how his shoulders stiffened with a weight only memory could bring. That night, back at his small home in Colorado Springs, Martin sat on his porch and read the stack of letters that had arrived. One in particular stood out, a drawing from a 7-year-old boy showing a man with a beard and a metal leg holding hands with another man under a tree labeled Heroes. Martin chuckled softly. "Kids got better vision than most adults," he muttered. The following week, the city council voted unanimously to rename the street where Martin's garage stood. It became Silent Service Way. Veterans from all over began stopping by, not for repairs, but for conversation, for wisdom, for peace. Martin never turned anyone away. When Memorial Day arrived, local schools asked him to speak. He refused each time, but eventually, when pressed, he agreed on one condition. "I'll talk," he said, "but not about me. Only about those who never got to come home." And so he did. Each year, quietly, powerfully. One May, standing in front of a sea of children in pressed uniforms and waving flags, Martin ended his speech with a single sentence: "Courage isn't loud. It's the man who walks alone, keeps his promise, and never asks to be seen." And then, as always, he left before the applause. On his 85th birthday, Logan appeared at his doorstep, not alone, but with 7 young SEALs in tow. Each had heard of Martin. Each had trained under methods he helped design. And most shocking of all, Sarah Myers returned too. Now a journalist bringing her mother and 2 children to meet the man who had fought beside the grandfather she never knew. He'd be proud to know his granddaughter. "Met you," Martin said, voice thin but steady. "And I think he'd like that the promise was finally fulfilled." 3 years later, Martin Cole passed quietly in his sleep. No pain, just peace. At his funeral, attended by over 200 people, his coffin was carried by Logan and 5 active-duty SEALs. He was buried with full honors. The metal leg that had carried him through decades of quiet service was replaced in his coffin with a new one donated by a veterans organization inspired by his story. And etched into his tombstone beneath his name were the words that had come to define him. His silence spoke volumes. His service changed lives. The town still tells his story. Children still trace the dagger anchor on the diner wall, and every year on the same Sunday, Sarah and Logan meet at that window table, order 2 burgers, and leave one untouched, just as Martin would have wanted. Because some promises are too sacred to break, and some heroes speak not through medals or speeches, but through the quiet, steadfast grace of a life well lived. The seasons turned, but the memory of Martin Cole only grew stronger in Maplewood. What had begun as a moment of recognition between an old man and a young soldier had now become something far greater, a ripple that moved through the community, the military, and beyond. Months after Martin's passing, the Maplewood Diner found itself at the center of national attention, again, not through viral photos or trending posts, but through something deeper: transformation. The owner of the diner, a man named Joseph Carver, who had been out of town the day Martin was mistreated, returned to find his business forever changed. The photo of Logan saluting Martin had been framed and placed above the main booth. A plaque had been screwed into the wall next to it. He came to remember one. We remember him all. Joseph didn't try to profit off the moment. Instead, he designated the back room of the diner as the Quiet Hall, a space reserved exclusively for veterans and their families, with no media, no cameras, just coffee, silence, and dignity. Local high school students began volunteering at the diner on Sundays, serving meals to elderly veterans, not because they had to, but because they wanted to understand the weight of history that lived among them. Sarah Myers, now the lead feature reporter for the state's largest paper, began a series called The Silent Ones, highlighting veterans whose contributions had gone unnoticed for decades. Each story she wrote drew from a single lesson she had learned from Martin: that true service did not seek recognition, it lived in action, sacrifice, and integrity. Logan Pierce, now promoted to an instructor role, carried Martin's photo in his wallet and had it pinned inside his locker at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. During lectures, he never mentioned himself. But when cadets complained about the intensity of drills or questioned the importance of logistics in combat planning, he would pause and say, "Let me tell you about Echo 6. Every time he did, the room would go silent. He would speak of Martin's precision under fire, his ability to memorize topography in minutes, his instinct for survival that saved more lives than anyone could count. He would end the story with the same line: he didn't win medals. He built legacies. Logan often thought about the day he met Martin, how random it seemed at first, how fated it now felt. He'd almost skipped the trip to Maplewood. He had debated waiting until the following week. But something had pulled him there, a whisper in his bones, maybe even a guiding hand. He knew better than to chalk it up to coincidence. Meanwhile, across the country, a quiet revolution was beginning. Inspired by Martin's story, a non-profit called Operation Silent Valor was formed dedicated to seeking out unsung veterans and preserving their legacies. They visited homeless shelters, nursing homes, mechanic garages, anywhere someone might be carrying a war within them without a voice. They would ask gently, "Do you have a story to tell?" And more often than not, they did. Some had letters they never sent. Others had medals stuffed in drawers. Many simply had scars on their bodies and their minds. But now, they had a place to be heard. Logan became one of the organization's key advisors, while Sarah became its first board chair. The name Martin Cole was never used to promote the organization per his wishes, but every volunteer wore a small pin, a dagger, through a broken anchor. It needed no explanation. The veterans understood. On the first anniversary of Martin's death, a modest crowd gathered at the silent serviceway. There were no speeches, no microphones, just people, young and old, civilians and soldiers, mechanics, waitresses, children holding handmade signs that read, "We remember." Logan stood in the back arms, crossed sunglasses hiding the emotion he couldn't quite suppress. Sarah placed a single burger on the bench beside Martin's memorial stone. The sun filtered through the trees, casting soft light across the crowd. A breeze carried the faint sound of wind chimes from the diner across the street, and for a moment the world was still. No engines, no horns, just memory, just presence. After the crowd dispersed, Logan stayed behind. He knelt before the stone, pressing his hand gently against it. "You changed everything," he whispered, without saying a word. Back at the base, Logan introduced a new module into SEAL training titled Legacy Logistics. It covered not just the practicalities of supply chains and tactical withdrawal routes, but the human stories behind them. He ended each class with a photo of Martin and Daniel smiling in the mud. "You'll never know their names from medals," he said, "but you owe them every safe extraction you've ever seen." The impact spread further than expected. A film production company reached out to Sarah about adapting Martin's life into a feature documentary. She refused at first. It would turn him into something loud, she said. He hated that. But Logan called her late one evening voice heavy with something deeper. "We don't need to tell it for the headlines," he said. "We need to tell it so the next Martin isn't sitting alone at a diner being laughed at." And so she agreed on one condition: no actors, no dramatization. Only real veterans, real places, real memories. The documentary, titled The Promise Kept, premiered a year later at a small theater in Colorado Springs. Among the crowd were members of Echo Team, those who had survived now in their 70s, tears streaming silently down their cheeks. The final scene of the film showed a reenactment of that quiet diner moment: an old man, a young soldier, a single salute, and the shift of a town's soul. When the credits rolled, no one clapped. They stood quietly, each lost in thought, each changed in some invisible way. At the exit, every attendee received a small card. It read, "When you see someone walking alone with a story in their step, remember some heroes are silent, but their footprints echo forever." A few months later, Sarah received a call from the White House. The president had seen the film and wanted to posthumously award Martin Cole the Presidential Citizens Medal. Sarah declined politely. He wouldn't have accepted it. The White House instead donated to Operation Silent Valor and hosted a private reception for its volunteers. Logan stood in that room in his dress blues, representing the legacy that began not on a battlefield, but in a diner between silence and remembrance. And in Maplewood, life continued. Children still ran through the streets, now pointing at the mural of Martin and asking their parents, "Was he really a hero?" The parents smiled and replied, "He still is." Every Veterans Day, the diner fills early. The corner table is left untouched, a fresh meal placed in front of an empty chair. And each year, someone new asks, "Who was he?" And the answer is always the same. He was the man who kept a promise. The one who reminded us what honor really looks like. Because even now, years after his final salute, Martin Cole's story lives not in noise, but in every quiet act of recognition, in every soldier who pauses before laughing, in every diner that remembers to ask before they judge. In a world too quick to forget, one man's silence reminded us all how to remember. Autumn settled over Maplewood with a quiet grace that felt almost ceremonial, as if the town itself understood that the changing leaves were not just nature's rhythm, but a soft tribute to those who came before, especially to the man whose presence had altered its soul. The diner now served as an unofficial archive of transformation. People came not just for breakfast or coffee, but to stand for a moment in front of the glass encase photograph near the register, a black and white still of Martin Cole and Logan Pierce in the moment of that unforgettable salute. Children would press their small palms to the case, whispering questions to their parents. Teachers brought school groups there to teach more than just history, to teach humility. In the corner booth, always reserved but never used, sat a folded napkin, a single slice of toast, and a small card that read, "Reserved for the silent." Though years had passed since that morning, the air inside the diner still carried the weight of that moment, like the lingering scent of pine long after Christmas, or the echo of a loved one's voice in an empty hallway. But not all echoes were sweet. One afternoon, a man entered the diner, whose presence caused an instant chill. He was tall, lean, with graying hair slicked back and eyes that darted nervously. He wore a veteran's hat, pristine, untouched by time, and a polished bomber jacket far too clean to have ever faced real fire. He slid into a booth and asked for the Martin Cole table. When told politely that the table was reserved for remembrance, his tone shifted. "I served two, you know. More than that mechanic ever did." His voice was sharp bitter, carrying a resentment that had festered for years. Sarah Myers now, a fixture at the diner and custodian of its soul, overheard. She approached calmly, placing a coffee in front of him. "What unit did you serve in?" she asked, eyes steady. The man hesitated, then mumbled something about reconnaissance. But he didn't know the difference between SEAL Echo and SEAL Bravo. He couldn't explain his ribbon bar. And when he tried to quote rank protocol, he stumbled. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. He was a fraud, one of those who adorned themselves in someone else's glory, seeking recognition without sacrifice. The room grew tense. Logan, who had just arrived with two cadets visiting from out of town, stood beside Sarah. "Leave the table alone." Logan said, his voice low but uncompromising. "That seat isn't for show. It's for silence. And silence is earned." The man huffed and stormed out, but the message had been delivered. Not all who wore the uniform understood the weight of its meaning. That day sparked something deeper in Logan. He realized that while Martin's memory was cherished, it was also at risk of being diluted, commercialized, or, worse, forgotten amid louder, flashier narratives. So he proposed something unprecedented, a living legacy program. Not a statue, not a building, but a mentorship pipeline pairing young SEAL recruits with retired low-profile veterans across the country who had never been publicly honored but had shaped operations behind the scenes. The program was dubbed Echo Line, a nod to Martin's team, and Sarah was named its director of story preservation. They began collecting oral histories, hours of video, handwritten letters, whispered confessions, moments of grief, pride, silence. Many of these veterans had never spoken of their service, not even to family. But when shown Martin's photo and told his story, they opened like old lockboxes, finally finding the right key. The project snowballed. Universities offered interns to help with archiving. A streaming platform requested permission to turn the growing archive into an interactive public library. But Logan insisted no ads, no politics, just stories, pure and unfiltered. Meanwhile, in Maplewood, a remarkable shift was occurring. The local high school began offering a class called Legacy and Leadership, centered around values exemplified by Martin. Students read excerpts from Operation Silent Valor interviews, wrote essays on the cost of service, and participated in service projects across town, repairing homes, delivering groceries to elderly neighbors, volunteering at shelters. One student, a quiet 15-year-old named Eli, became especially drawn to Martin's story. His father had served in Iraq, but had returned distant, broken by things he refused to name. Eli struggled to connect with him, but through the project, he found fragments of understanding. One day he stood beside Martin's bench, tracing the engraved quote with his finger. "He never asked to be seen." Eli murmured. That evening, for the first time in months, he sat beside his father on the porch and simply said, "Tell me about your friends." And for the first time in years, his father did. That singular moment sparked a wave of reconciliations across families in town. The narrative of veterans shifted from stoic relics to living bridges connecting the past's sacrifices with the present's gratitude. Sarah chronicled it all. She began writing a book not about Martin alone, but about the people he had touched without ever intending to. It was titled The Man Who Sat Quietly. When the manuscript was completed, Logan asked to write the foreword. In it, he wrote Martin didn't speak often, but when he did, it rewrote how we define heroism. He reminded us that valor isn't in the medals we wear, it's in the promises we keep even when no one is watching. On the day the book was published, a soft ceremony was held at the Maplewood Diner. No banners, no speeches, just a quiet unveiling of a new tradition. Every first Sunday of the month, veterans and civilians would sit together, sharing meals and stories. No separation, no formalities. Just presence, just listening. One young boy, 8 years old, missing 2 front teeth, asked Sarah during the gathering, "Do you think Mr. Martin knows we still talk about him?" She knelt, met his eyes, and smiled. "I think he hears every word." Outside, the autumn wind picked up rustling the flags lining Silent Service Way. And somewhere beyond the reach of time, a man with a quiet soul and a broken anchor tattoo smiled, knowing that in the stillness he had once been forced to bear a movement, had begun one that now roared in the hearts of those who understood what it meant to serve, to remember, and above all, to keep a promise. Winter arrived in Maplewood not with violence, but with a hush. Snowflakes settling on rooftops like silent applause, the streets lined with wreaths and warm lights that flickered against the evening frost. Yet beneath the holiday cheer, the town pulsed with something deeper, a quiet reverence that had taken root and spread like fire through dry timber. Martin Cole had been gone for over a year, but his presence had only grown louder in the silence he left behind. His story had reached far beyond Kentucky. Now letters poured in from Vietnam, vets in Oregon, Gulf, war medics in Florida, Cold War intelligence officers in D.C., all echoing the same refrain, "I thought no one remembered men like us." And slowly, quietly, the world began to change. At the heart of this shift stood Operation Silent Valor, now headquartered in a modest brick building downtown just 2 blocks from the Maplewood Diner. Its front door bore a simple plaque for those who never asked to be seen. Inside, veterans sat in armchairs sipping coffee, reading letters telling stories, some for the first time in 50 years. There were no reporters, no flashes, only time, space, and ears that finally listened. Logan Pierce, now captain, split his weeks between the base and Maplewood, but it was here among these men and women who wore their histories like invisible scars that he felt most at home. One snowy morning, he arrived to find an envelope sitting on the reception desk. No return address. Just a single sentence typed on the front, "I saw him too." Inside was a black and white photograph, grainy aged, with 2 young SEALs in muddy gear crouched behind enemy lines. One of them was unmistakably Martin. The other wore a crooked grin and a patch that read, "J. Harrington." Daniel Myers. The letter that came with it was brief, handwritten in shaky script. "My name is Paul Nance. I was with Echo 6. I've kept this photo for over 50 years. I didn't know anyone else remembered. I thought I was the last one." Logan's heart pounded as he read it again. Another member of the lost team alive, watching, waiting. He immediately contacted Sarah Myers. They traced the letter's postmark to a town in West Virginia. 2 days later, they arrived in a cold, wind-blown village nestled in the mountains, where a reclusive man in his 80s answered the door with trembling hands. "Are you here about Martin?" he asked, even before they introduced themselves. Paul Nance was frail, but his eyes burned with clarity. Inside his small cabin, the walls were covered with maps, photographs, and newspaper clippings. He had followed every step of Martin's posthumous rise from obscurity to reverence. "I didn't come forward because I didn't think I was worth remembering," he said, hands shaking as he poured tea. "I ran logistics, not glamorous, not battlefield glory, just planning, supplies, routes. People think it's nothing." Logan leaned forward, voice steady. "That's why we're here, because men like you made the impossible possible." Sarah placed the photo from the diner, Martin being saluted on the table. Paul stared at it for a long time, eyes misting over. "He never wanted recognition," Paul whispered, "but he deserved the world." They recorded his story that day. 8 hours of memories. Stories of dust storms and codebooks of radio signals bouncing off jungle canopies of lives saved. And one unforgettable moment, the night Martin, half conscious from blood loss, recited coordinates through gritted teeth as enemy gunfire rained around them. "He saved us all," Paul said, but he never talked about it. He thought doing it was enough. As they left the cabin, Paul reached for Logan's arm. "Promise me something," he said. "Don't let them forget the quiet ones. We carried the same weight, just in the shadows." Logan nodded. "I swear it." Back in Maplewood, Sarah included Paul's story in the next volume of The Silent Ones. The town printed it in their Sunday paper. Veterans from all branches began sending in photos notes, even relics, an old compass, a dog tag wrapped in cloth, a boot with initials carved into the heel. Operation Silent Valor became a sanctuary not just for the living, but for memory itself. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening among the youth. Inspired by what they read and heard, teenagers in Maplewood began forming what they called echo clubs. These weren't school clubs for resume padding or social status. They were commitments. Once a month, students would visit local veterans, record oral histories, write tribute essays, and most importantly, spend time. No phones, no distractions, just presence. One student, Mia Alvarez, who had once been on the verge of dropping out due to trauma at home, was assigned to visit a grizzled World War II vet named Walter. At first, neither spoke much, but on the third visit, Walter showed her a bullet casing he'd kept since 1944. "This one almost ended me," he said. Mia held it with both hands. "Then it brought me here," she said softly. From that day on, she never missed a visit. And a year later, she applied to West Point. In her personal statement, she wrote, "I thought heroism had to be loud. Martin Cole taught me it could be silent, but powerful enough to change everything." Sarah read the essay in her office and cried, not for sadness, but for legacy. Logan proposed a national expansion of the Echo Club model. The Pentagon approved. Grants flowed in. Cities across America began forming their own Echo hubs, quietly, with no fanfare, just honor. And yet, through all this, Logan couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something unfinished. One night, sitting alone in his apartment, he pulled out Martin's letter from his old commander, the one found in his wallet after he passed. He read it again and again. Then it hit him. There was one line in the letter, "You taught us that courage doesn't need a witness, it only needs to be chosen." Logan stood suddenly inspired and began sketching a proposal, a monument, but not of stone, not of bronze, a virtual map and interactive, ever-expanding tribute called the Echo Grid. Every silent veteran's story, archived, would be marked as a glowing point on the map. Click it, and their voice would speak. Their photo would appear, their footsteps would echo. But most importantly, no ranking, no order of importance, just names, faces, humanity. Sarah worked beside him to fund the project. Schools adopted it as part of their curriculum. Military academies included it in their values training. And at the very top of the grid, hovering silently like a constellation above the rest, was Martin Cole. But his biography was just one sentence. He kept a promise when no one else was looking. When the Echo Grid launched nationally, millions logged on in the first week. Not to scroll, but to stop, to sit, to listen. And in living rooms, classrooms, bus stops, barracks across the country, people did exactly that. They listened. Somewhere, maybe in the rustle of wind through a Kentucky tree line, or in the quiet breath of a child hearing a veteran's story. For the first time, Martin Cole smiled. Because promises kept never die. They grow, they inspire, and they remind the world that silence, when chosen for the sake of others, is the loudest legacy of all. Spring crept into Maplewood with a patience that felt almost sacred, as though even the seasons had learned to tread lightly in a town now defined by the reverence it held for the unseen, the unheard, and the once forgotten. Trees that lined Silent Service Way bloomed with blossoms so vivid they looked painted against the sky, and below their branches children played in the shade of history, their laughter echoing softly beside the bronze sidewalk plates etched with names of silent veterans uncovered by Operation Silent Valor. The Echo Grid had grown beyond anything Logan or Sarah had imagined. What had started as a digital constellation of uncelebrated heroism had evolved into a living, breathing mosaic of service and sacrifice. By now, every major city had its own Echo Hub modest buildings, where volunteers compiled, archived, and preserved stories from veterans who had never spoken before. One of the most moving submissions came from a woman in Arizona named Evelyn Brooks, now 92, who had served as a field nurse in Korea and carried a journal filled with names of soldiers she'd tried to save, and one she never forgot, Martin Cole. "I met him just once," she wrote, in a tent outside Daegu, where he carried in a man half his size across 5 miles of hillside. He didn't say a word, just laid him down, saluted, and limped away. I asked for his name. He just said, "The guy's name is Jim. That's who matters today." I only recognized him now, after all these years. Her entry became one of the most visited on the Echo Grid. Meanwhile, Logan found himself called to speak at conferences, military academies, memorial events, not because of his rank, but because of the story he carried in his bones. He always refused the spotlight. Instead, he walked to the podium with only one object in hand, Martin's faded dog tag, found folded into the back pocket of his jacket on the day he passed. He'd hold it up silently for a full minute before speaking. It was never planned, just felt right. This, he would say, wasn't meant to be famous, but it became unforgettable. That's what keeping a promise can do. Sarah, on the other hand, had begun traveling across the country, giving workshops in high schools and community centers about legacy literacy. The idea that every family, no matter how broken or proud, holds within it a story that can shape the next generation, if we only stop and ask. At one school in Chicago, a student named Isaiah came forward after her session, silent. At first, then said, "My uncle was in the Navy. He died last year. No one came to his funeral but me and my mom." Sarah placed a hand gently on his shoulder and replied, "Then tell me about him. I'll make sure someone listens." That single moment led to a new branch of the Echo Initiative, Legacy Voices, where young people often estranged from the military world became the guardians of their own family's unspoken heroism. Isaiah's interview went viral. He described a man who worked 2 jobs, never wore his uniform, but kept a folded letter from a commanding officer inside a Bible. When asked why it moved him so much, Isaiah said, "Because he never told anyone he was brave. He just lived like someone who owed the world nothing and gave everything anyway." That quote became the opening line of the second Echo documentary, Carried in Silence, which premiered quietly on Memorial Day in a dozen small theaters across America. No red carpets, no celebrity voiceovers. Just the voices of the forgotten speaking at last. In Maplewood, a new memorial park had begun construction near the edge of town, funded entirely by anonymous donations and a portion of proceeds from Sarah's book. But this was not a park of statues. It was a path, a winding trail through trees, where each bench bore a small engraved story, pulled from the Echo Grid. Visitors walked not to observe, but to reflect. Each step was a story, each pause a lesson. At the entrance, no plaque of war dates or names of generals, only a single sentence carved into stone. "Let us honor not only the victories we see, but the silences we never questioned." Logan's personal life, once eclipsed by duty, began to open again. He met someone, Elena, a history teacher, who had been using the Echo Grid to teach her 8th graders about Vietnam. Their first conversation wasn't about work or war, but about books, how both had found solace in the things they carried, and how neither had expected to fall in love with someone who understood the heaviness of silence. As their relationship deepened, Logan began to imagine something he never had before, a life beyond the uniform, a future where he could teach right and carry the legacy, not just in speeches, but in the way he raised his own family one day. One quiet evening, as he and Elena walked past the Maplewood Diner, they noticed something new painted onto the sidewalk. Outside was a faded outline of a boot print overlaid with the words, "He walked so others could stand." It hadn't been commissioned, just appeared. No one claimed credit, but everyone knew what it meant. Sarah smiled when she saw it the next morning. She didn't post about it. She didn't write a headline. She just knelt, touched it with 2 fingers, and whispered, "Still walking, aren't you?" That spring, the president, unprompted, without ceremony, signed an executive order to recognize a new national day, Silent Valor Day, observed annually on May 17th, the day Martin Cole passed. It was not a federal holiday. There were no parades. Instead, the nation was encouraged to perform one quiet act of remembrance: visit a veteran, write a letter, sit by a grave, or simply listen to someone whose voice had long gone unheard. The first year, millions participated. Logan marked the day by returning to Martin's grave alone, placing 2 burgers on the stone, one with ketchup, only just the way Martin liked it. "Still holding your end of the promise," Logan whispered, hand over heart. "And I'm still holding mine." The wind stirred. A single blossom from the nearby dogwood tree drifted down, landing softly on the top of the headstone, like a silent salute from the earth itself. And in that moment, all across the nation, people sat in diners, parks, classrooms, living rooms, thinking not of fireworks or fanfare, but of dignity, quiet courage, and the gentle legacy of a man who had never needed the world to see him, just to remember what he stood for. Summer draped itself over Maplewood like a warm, steady breath, soft winds rustling the flags lining Silent Service Way, the streets alive with the kind of quiet pride that didn't need fireworks to be felt. It was the first summer since the national observance of Silent Valor Day had been signed into recognition, and yet there was no grand celebration planned in the town where it all began. That was intentional. No parades, no marching bands, no speeches blaring from loudspeakers. Instead, on the morning of May the 17th, every business along Main Street placed a single candle in their front window, unlit, symbolizing the silence of service, and a small placard beneath it, bearing only a name from the Echo grid. Some chose names of relatives, others picked names at random. It didn't matter. Each name had meaning now. Each name had been pulled from a past the world had almost let disappear. At the diner, the place where it all began, the usual breakfast crowd came in slowly, like parishioners to a sanctuary. Logan Pierce arrived just before opening and was greeted with a nod by Joseph Carver, the owner who said nothing but handed him a small key. For the back room, he whispered. Logan nodded. Inside the quiet hall, once just a storage area, now a sanctuary for memories, stood a new installation, a wooden table handcrafted by local veterans bearing a single object in the center beneath a glass dome. It was Martin Cole's cane, the same one he had leaned on the day the world rediscovered him. On a bronze plate beneath it were the words, "Strength isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's just the sound of someone still standing." Logan stood before it for a long while, head bowed, remembering not the man who was celebrated now, but the man he'd first seen limping out of a diner, head low heart, heavy not knowing his world was about to change. Outside, school children lined up at the park, not for play, but to take part in the Footsteps Walk, a new tradition, where they were handed laminated cards each bearing the name of a veteran and a single sentence from their story. They would walk the trail in silence, stopping at each bench to leave a note, a flower, a drawing. Some cried, though they didn't know why. Others just walked slower. Logan watched them from a distance and felt something shift in his chest, like the past and the future had finally reached out and shaken hands. Meanwhile, Sarah Myers stood at the far end of the path, notebook in hand, eyes scanning each child, each parent, each quiet gesture. She wasn't there as a journalist today. She was there as a granddaughter. The burger on Martin's bench sat untouched, its ketchup beginning to soften the bun under the warm morning sun. She ran her hand gently along the backrest and whispered, "He'd love this." Not for the attention, for the silence. That evening when the candles were lit at sundown, the town transformed into something sacred. Windows glowed not with celebration, but with memory. On the steps of Town Hall, a projection screen was set up, not for a blockbuster, but to showcase 10 short films submitted from Echo Hubs across the country, each one telling a single story of a silent veteran, each narrated by a young person who had taken up their torch. One film from a small town in Montana featured a 13-year-old girl reading aloud the journal of her great-grandfather, a medic in WPUs, who never spoke of the war, but had drawn pictures of every soldier he'd tried to save. Her voice trembled, but never broke. "I think he carried the weight of their stories, because no one else could." She said, "Now I will." The audience was still. The final film came from Maplewood itself. Sarah and Logan had collaborated on it in secret. It was called The Seat Left Empty. The film opened with silent footage of Martin entering the diner on that fateful day, recreated with care, using real interviews, then shifted into the real footage, Logan's salute, the patrons rising, the ripple effect that had reached across a nation. It ended on a still shot of Martin's grave, adorned not with flowers, but with letters, hundreds of handwritten notes stacked neatly at the base. The final caption read, "He asked for nothing, and gave everything." When the film ended, no one spoke, no one applauded. People just stood. Some cried, some hugged, some stared at the screen long after it went dark, unwilling to let go of what they had just felt. That night, after the town slowly returned to its homes, Logan walked alone to the diner. The streets were quiet, but not empty. The air carried the weight of remembrance like incense. When he reached the corner booth, the booth where Martin had once been told he didn't belong, he sat down without a word. On the table was a fresh cup of coffee and a folded napkin. Beneath the napkin was a note unsigned. It read, "He was never alone. He just didn't know who was watching." Logan's hands trembled slightly as he folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. He looked out the window toward the horizon, where a faint light had begun to break through the clouds. And as he sat there, he imagined Martin walking again this time, without the limp, without the burden, through fields of memory that stretched into forever. The silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of names, full of echoes, full of footsteps that had once been forgotten, but now would never be. The second year of Silent Valor Day came with more than candles and quiet walks. It came with questions honest and searching ones from a younger generation that had begun to inherit not just the comforts of peace, but the responsibility of understanding what that peace had cost. In Maplewood High, a history teacher named Elena Foster Logan's partner, now wife, introduced a semester-long project called Echoes We Carry. The idea was simple, yet profound. Each student would choose one name from the Echo Grid, research everything they could, and then write a letter, not a report, but a conversation as if the veteran could read it. The project ignited something unexpected. Teenagers who had once rolled their eyes at history now stayed after class poring over handwritten mission transcripts, decoding abbreviations from old telegrams, searching for fragments of humanity inside the footnotes of war. One student, Amara Jenkins, discovered her assigned name. Corporal Samuel Ruiz had died in Vietnam before turning 20. He had written poetry in the margins of his military handbook, small verses about stars and rivers and his mother's cooking. Amara spent days reading those faded lines, then wrote him a letter that ended with, "You didn't come home, but your words did. I carry them now. I carry you." The letter was read aloud at the school's end-of-year assembly, and there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. Across town, the Maplewood Library, once an overlooked building with flickering fluorescent lights and aging shelves, had been reborn into the Cole Cultural Center, a community hub for intergenerational dialogue. Veterans came there not just to donate artifacts or tell stories, they came to connect. At a roundtable session one Wednesday, an 88-year-old Korean War veteran named Harold West sat across from a college student studying international relations. The two spoke for 3 hours. At the end, Harold looked at the student and said, "I spent 60 years thinking no one would ever want to hear what I saw. You made me feel like I didn't disappear." The student, wiping his eyes, replied, "You didn't. You were just waiting for the world to slow down enough to listen." These quiet revolutions were happening everywhere now. From barbershops in Detroit to diners in New Mexico, the story of Martin Cole had transcended the particulars of one man's life. It had become a mirror, a symbol, not of glory, but of gravity. A reminder that real heroism didn't always come dressed in accolades. Sometimes it came in grease-stained coveralls with a bad knee and a tattoo only 8 people in the world could recognize. Logan watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. He had never intended to become the steward of Martin's legacy, and yet each day brought a new thread to weave into the growing tapestry. The day after Amara's letter went viral, Logan received a call from a senator's office asking if he'd consider leading a bipartisan task force on veteran mental health. He declined, not because he didn't care, but because bureaucracy had never been the soil in which Martin's legacy had grown. Instead, he suggested something else: fund the storytelling, fund the listening, give the unheard a microphone and a human being, not a form to talk to. To his surprise, the senator agreed. That summer, the Department of Veterans Affairs announced a $25 million grant for the expansion of Echo Grid Story House's physical locations, where veterans could walk in, sit down, and be heard without judgment or agenda. The first one was built in Denver, the second in Tampa. The third, by unanimous vote, opened in the heart of Maplewood. It was named the Martin Room, and it wasn't a shrine. It was alive. Leather chairs, shelves lined with donated journals, tablets preloaded with recorded histories, and a wall where anyone, veteran or civilian, could pin a note beginning with "I remember." Sarah, who now served as executive director of Operation Silent Valor, visited the Martin Room once a week. She'd sit for hours sometimes just reading notes. One caught her eye in late July, written in the shaky hand of a child. "I don't know anyone who went to war, but I think it must have been scary. Thank you for being brave, even if you were scared." She cried not for sadness, but for hope that the torch was already being passed, that the next generation might not have to wait decades to be seen. Meanwhile, Logan received a package in the mail one morning with no return address. Inside was a sealed envelope marked for Echo 6. Within it was a letter dated 1972, written by Daniel Myers Martin's best friend the night before their final mission. It had never been sent. Somehow, it had survived. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed, but the words were raw. If I don't make it, tell Martin not to carry it alone. Tell him the promise wasn't just about burgers, it was about coming home with your head high, even if your body's broken. If he made it, then the best of us did. And that's enough for me. Logan folded the letter with trembling hands. That evening, during a small gathering in the quiet hall, he read it aloud. There was no applause, just silence. And then the sound of someone softly placing their hand on Martin's cane, as if to say, "We heard you. We finally heard you." Outside the town square flickered with the golden glow of dusk. Children chased each other between benches engraved with names. Couples held hands beneath lanterns. An old man played harmonica on a corner, his case open not for money, but for memory. And above it all, carved into the highest point of the Cole Cultural Center, a new engraving had been added by unanimous town vote. He never asked for a statue. So, we became his monument. And indeed they had. Every person who carried a story forward, every student who read a name, every stranger who chose to listen, before judging, they were Martin's legacy now. And as the stars blinked awake above Maplewood, it became clear that though the man had walked alone that morning, long ago, he had never truly been alone. He had walked ahead, so the rest of us could find our way. The third autumn, since Martin Cole's passing, descended upon Maplewood not like a reminder of decay, but as a return to roots, a quiet renewal steeped in amber leaves and reverent stillness. By now his name had woven itself not just into buildings or benches, but into the very rhythm of the town's breath. The students who had once whispered questions about the man with the limp were now young adults standing taller, speaking softer, listening longer. The veterans who once sat alone now gathered regularly at the Martin Room, no longer strangers, but keepers of each other's ghosts. One such morning, an unassuming man named Curtis Reed entered the room, dragging behind him a rolling cart covered with canvas. He was in his 70s, a retired train conductor, and when the volunteers asked his story, he said nothing. Instead, he unwrapped the canvas to reveal a stack of paintings over 60 canvases each one, a scene from war and aftermath. There were no guns, no explosions, just expressions. A man holding a helmet staring at a photograph. A woman clutching a folded flag. A pair of muddy boots at the foot of a child's bed. Every image was raw, quiet, and unmistakably real. I painted them all from memory, Curtis said. Never thought anyone would see them. But I saw that girl's letter. The one about the poetry in the handbook. It made me think maybe the silence is finally safe to share. Sarah, upon hearing this, launched an art series called Echoes in Color, displaying veteran-made artwork in libraries and museums across the country. The inaugural exhibition held in the Maplewood Town Hall drew over 10,000 visitors in its first month. People stood for hours in front of Curtis's painting, titled The Seat at the Window, a depiction of Martin from behind his silhouette, cast in morning light, a cup of coffee in hand, no face shown. The plaque beneath it read, "Not all heroes face forward, some just endure." Meanwhile, Logan, now officially retired from active duty, found himself adjusting to civilian life, not as a loss, but as an evolution. He took a teaching position at a nearby college, offering a course titled Memory Service and the Weight of Silence. It was part history, part ethics, part storytelling. On the first day, instead of handing out a syllabus, he played the video of Martin being saluted, then turned to the class and said, "If this doesn't matter to you, nothing I teach will." No one left. In fact, the course became so popular that it required a lottery to enter. But Logan didn't care about numbers. He cared about one student, a quiet young woman named Tasha Nguyen, who always sat in the back and never spoke until week 6, when Logan asked the class, "What does it mean to serve without being seen?" Tasha raised her hand. "It means you loved something more than yourself," she said. "And you were willing to be invisible so it could live." Logan nodded and wrote her words on the board. They stayed there the rest of the semester. That same week, Sarah published the second volume of The Silent Ones. This time, it wasn't just veterans' stories. It included letters from the people they'd saved, people who had once been civilians, caught in the machinery of war, now writing decades later to say thank you. One such letter came from a man in Laos who as a child had been pulled from the wreckage of a field hospital by an American with a bad leg and kind eyes. His name was not known, but based on maps and timelines, there was a high chance it had been Martin. "I've lived 60 years because someone chose not to look away," the letter said. "My grandchildren now learn English because I told them about the man with the anchor on his wrist." The story swept through the town like wind through wheat, gentle but impossible to ignore. It became clear Martin's legacy was not just national, it was global. And so, the town began planning something bold. Not a statue, not another room, but a live broadcast. A night of stories shared simultaneously across every Echo Hub, streamed worldwide, titled "A Night for the Quiet Ones." It would be the first time the movement stepped into the light, fully not to boast, but to allow others to step forward. Logan was asked to host. He declined the spotlight, but offered to open with a reading. The night arrived. Across time zones and languages, millions tuned in. And Logan began with the letter found in Martin's jacket, Daniel Meyer's final words. But then he paused, looked into the camera, and said, "Tonight isn't about Martin. He would hate that. It's about what he made possible, about what each of you can choose to carry forward." The screen split into dozens of live feeds, veterans sharing stories in nursing homes, teenagers reading letters aloud in schools, families holding hands beside headstones. In one feed, a small child simply looked into the camera and said, "I don't understand war, but I understand love, and I think Martin did too." The broadcast ended not with applause, but with 3 minutes of global silence. The screen faded to black, and the world held its breath. Afterward, letters poured in from every continent. One came from a woman in Ukraine who wrote, "My father was a soldier. He died without fanfare, but tonight I think someone saw him." Another from Tokyo read, "We never knew his name before, but now we carry it in our hearts." And from a small village in Brazil, "We have a hero here too. He was quiet like Martin. Thank you for showing us how to listen." Logan read each letter, everyone. He kept them in a wooden box carved with Martin's emblem, the dagger and anchor tucked beneath his bed. On nights when sleep refused to come, he'd open it not to relive the past, but to remind himself that legacy wasn't about noise. It was about nourishment. And then one day, without announcement, he returned to the diner, alone. No ceremony, no press. He sat in the same corner booth where Martin once sat and simply looked out the window. After a few minutes, Joseph Carver approached with a coffee and placed it down. "Same table, same light," he said. "Almost feels like he's still here." Logan nodded. "He is," he whispered. "He's everywhere now, because we listened." Winter returned to Maplewood with the kind of quiet that blanketed not just rooftops, but hearts, a silence not of absence, but of reverence. By now, Martin Cole's name was no longer just a story passed between veterans or whispered over diner booths. It had become a lesson taught in classrooms, a reflection offered at Sunday sermons, and a promise carried in the inner pockets of strangers who had never met him, but somehow knew him. Across America, the ripple had turned into a tide. New towns were beginning their own Echo Hubs, and the Department of Education approved a national elective curriculum based on the Silent Ones series, teaching high school students not just about wars, but about the unseen hands that held the lines behind every headline. In Maplewood, something unexpected happened. A new family moved into town, a woman named Grace and her 10-year-old son, Elias, recently widowed, looking for a place quieter than the city, somewhere her son might stop flinching at the sound of sirens. They settled in a small house 2 streets away from the Cole Cultural Center. Elias didn't talk much at first. His teacher said he was polite but distant, as if he lived a few seconds behind everyone else. Then one day, walking home from school, he noticed a small bronze plaque embedded in the sidewalk. It was in front of the diner. It read, "He walked so others could stand." Something about it made him stop. He asked his mom what it meant. Grace wasn't sure, so they walked into the diner together. Joseph Carver was there, as always, wiping the counter. And when he saw the boy staring at the corner booth, he smiled and said, "That seat belonged to someone who changed the world without saying much. Want to hear his story?" And so Joseph told it. Martin's story in the way he had now, dozens of times, but never like this. Never to a boy whose own father had died a firefighter running into a building everyone else was running out of. Elias listened without blinking. When Joseph finished, Elias asked, "Did he save people too?" "Yes," Joseph said. "He just did it quietly." Elias came back the next day, and the next. He began writing short notes on napkins and leaving them on the bench in the quiet hall. Notes like, "I didn't know heroes could be quiet. I'm glad they can." Or, "My dad didn't get a statue either, but he's my Martin." One day Sarah found one that simply said, "When I grow up, I want to be a promise." That napkin was framed. Word of the boy's note spread, and soon children from other towns started mailing their own. Some were messy crayon drawings. Others were letters with shaky grammar but perfect sincerity. Operation Silent Valor launched a children's companion project, Little Echoes, a network of story circles, letters, and memory walks designed to teach children about courage without violence, service without glory. Logan was asked to give the keynote at its first national gathering. He walked onto the stage in a gymnasium full of families, veterans, and hundreds of children wearing t-shirts with the Echo emblem. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he brought Elias up beside him. "This young man reminded me," he said, "that legacy isn't about what we leave behind. It's about who picks it up." Elias, nervous but brave, read one of his napkin notes into the microphone. "I didn't know I could be strong without shouting. But Martin showed me that quiet is also brave." The room stood as one, not clapping, just standing. A new kind of salute. Back in Maplewood, the diner now hosted monthly legacy lunches where families came together to share meals and stories regardless of background or branch of service. At the very first one, Grace brought Elias, and they sat at the very table where Martin had once been told he was not welcome. Now that table was always full, sometimes of veterans, sometimes of children, sometimes of widows, sometimes of strangers, but always full. At the end of the meal, Elias stood and said, "I think heroes are just people who don't stop caring, even when no one says thank you." A hush followed, and then Joseph, wiping his eyes with a dish towel, whispered, "He would have liked you, kid." That winter something else happened, quietly, softly. The town voted to rename the elementary school. It wasn't called Cole Elementary or Veterans Elementary. It was named Promise Elementary. No statues, no mascots. Just a seal on the wall, a circle with a pair of walking boots, an anchor, and a dagger. Underneath, "Be the promise someone else kept for you." Logan visited the school on the first day of classes. As he walked the halls, he heard a teacher reading aloud the story of Martin, not just as a war hero, but as a man who showed the world what quiet strength could do. In one classroom, a child raised his hand and asked, "Did Martin ever smile?" The teacher said, "Not often. But when he did, people remembered it forever." And in the back of the room, Elias, now more confident, whispered, "I want to be someone who makes other people remember to be kind." And with that, the legacy deepened not in headlines or documentaries, but in everyday acts of gentleness born from the echo of one man's dignity. And as the snow began to fall again over Maplewood, blanketing the diner, the Martin room, and the silent footprints left in every child's heart, one thing became clear: the world had not just remembered Martin Cole, it had become more like him. Spring returned to Maplewood not with fanfare, but with a stillness so profound it felt holy, as though the earth itself paused, honoring what the town had become in silence. Cherry blossoms lined the sidewalks of Promise, elementary petals drifting onto the shoulders of children who no longer ran past bronze plaques without reading them. They had learned to slow down, to look closer, to ask. And in this new rhythm, the world continued to open, not wider, but deeper. In cities across the country, echo hubs became lifelines. Veterans who had once curled their stories into the tight fists of trauma began uncurling them, not all at once, but little by little. One woman, the Renee Marquez, who had spent 23 years in logistics for the Air Force, arrived at the San Antonio Echo House with a shoebox and a whisper. Inside were letters she had written, but never sent to fallen colleagues, to her mother, to herself. "I never thought anyone would want to read these," she said. But a young volunteer named Jacob, barely 19, sat beside her and replied, "I do. I want to learn from someone who never stopped showing up." She cried for the first time in years, not out of pain, but out of recognition. Across the globe, the Echo Grid had reached unexpected places, remote villages in Eastern Europe, classrooms in Nairobi, refugee camps in Lebanon. Where words failed, stories spoke. In one instance, a small coastal town in the Philippines hosted its own Silent Valor Day after discovering an Echo Grid entry about a Filipino-American soldier who had saved 30 locals during World War II. They held lanterns, lit candles, and read his name aloud. His great-granddaughter living in California saw the video online and wept. She had never known where he had been buried. Now she knew he had lived on. And all of it, every ripple could be traced back to that one moment in Maplewood. One man, one limp one, tear sliding down a forgotten cheek, and the silence that followed. Logan and Sarah watched the movement grow with awe, not as architects, but as witnesses. They never claimed credit. They never let the story shift from Martin's truth. It had never been about him. That spring, Logan decided to do something that scared him. He began writing his own story, not a biography of Martin, not a tribute to the Echo Initiative, but his own truth. The years he had buried his pain beneath protocol, the guilt he had carried after losing teammates, the anger he had once felt toward a world that didn't know how to honor those who served in the shadows. He titled the manuscript, The Weight of Quiet. It was raw, honest at times, unpolished, but real. And in the final chapter, he wrote, Martin didn't just teach us to remember. He taught us how to walk back into the world after carrying the unbearable and lay it down without shame. Sarah read the draft and placed her hand on his. You've laid it down now. That same week, a surprise letter arrived at Operation Silent Valor's headquarters. It was from a woman named Lily Cole, a distant relative of Martin's they hadn't known existed. She had lived overseas for years, disconnected from family, unaware of the legacy unfolding in her uncle's name. Her letter was simple. I saw a boy wearing a shirt with an anchor and a dagger in Tokyo. I stopped him and asked. He told me about Martin. I think I'd like to come home now. When she arrived in Maplewood, she was met at the bus stop by Logan, Sarah, and Elias. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. She walked through the town, slowly stopping at the diner, at the Martin room, at the mural on the library wall. And then she turned to them and said, I don't know how to thank a man I never met, but who somehow raised me from across time. That weekend, Lily spoke at a legacy lunch. She told the story of Martin as a boy, how he used to stay up late reading about old cartographers, fascinated by the way people used to navigate oceans, with only the stars and their instincts. Maybe that's why he never needed applause, she said. He already knew where he was going. The room sat in silence. Logan looked at Elias now, taller, more assured, and saw the same quiet fire Martin once carried. That evening, Logan walked alone to Martin's grave beneath the tree, where the town had placed a wind chime that rang only when the air was stillest. He knelt and placed a folded copy of his manuscript on the ground, along with a new photo, Elias standing beside a chalkboard, teaching his class about legacy. You lit something in us, Logan whispered, and we've kept it burning. The wind stirred gently. The chime rang once. And from the edge of the cemetery, a group of children began walking the path of stories, the same trail once walked by strangers, now a pilgrimage of remembrance. At its end, beneath the engraved words, he kept a promise. When no one else was looking, they left a new message carved into wood, signed only by the students of Promise Elementary. It read, We see you now. We hear you. We are you. The 5th year since Martin Cole's quiet passing arrived with the kind of stillness that didn't feel empty, it felt earned. By now, Maplewood was no longer just a town. It was a living monument to everything he stood for. But more than that, it had become a mirror for a nation, slowly learning that strength could be gentle, that courage didn't have to shout, and that legacy, when rooted in dignity, could grow forever without fanfare. On the morning of Silent Valor Day, the sun rose slower, warmer, casting a soft golden light on the diner windows, the Cole Cultural Center, the benches along the memory trail, and the front lawn of Promise Elementary, where every child stood in a quiet row, holding a single white flower. There were no rehearsed lines, no applause. Just one by one they stepped forward and placed the flowers beneath a large circular emblem carved into the ground, Martin's symbol surrounded by the names of all the silent ones who had since been added to the echo grid. In the center of the circle, Elias stood taller now, nearly 15, holding a small book in his hands. The Weight of Quiet, newly published, now required reading in a dozen school districts. Logan watched from the edge of the crowd, standing beside Sarah, his hand gently over hers. His hair had silvered, but his eyes were steady, filled with a peace he had never known in his younger years. After the children finished, Elias looked at the circle and spoke not loudly, but with the kind of clarity that doesn't ask for attention, only for truth. He was just one man. He walked alone. But because he did, the rest of us don't have to. The moment settled into the air like a hymn. That afternoon, the entire town gathered not for a ceremony, but for a meal, Tables lined the street. Strangers sat beside each other. Veterans sat beside children. At each seat was a card with a single name from the Echo Grid and a prompt, ask, listen, remember. It was the kind of gathering Martin would have quietly walked through, maybe pausing at a corner to sip his coffee quietly proud, but wishing no one would notice him. Except now, he was everywhere. In the art hanging from the elementary school hallways, in the storybooks children checked out from the Cole Library, in the quiet way people made space for one another, in the unspoken understanding that someone always walks ahead not to be seen, but so others can follow with steadier steps. At sunset, the diner turned off its lights. The window that once framed Martin's silhouette now held only a single candle, its flame flickering gently against the glass. Logan approached the table and placed a folded napkin there. On it, handwritten in ink, were these words, "You didn't need to speak. You taught us how to listen." He stepped back. A crowd had gathered outside. No one said a word. Then, a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, walked forward and placed a paper crane beside the napkin. She didn't say who she was. She just smiled and whispered, "Thank you." That night, as darkness draped itself over the rooftops of Maplewood, as stars blinked into view over Silent Service Way, a wind moved through the town, not loud but steady. It stirred, the flags rang. The chimes rustled the petals left on the trail and whispered through the trees lining the schoolyard. It moved through living rooms where people sat in silence, reading letters from strangers they now felt bonded to. It moved through the hearts of veterans who once thought their stories would die with them, but now lived in murals and journals in the voices of children who had never seen war but understood its weight. And in that wind, if you listened closely, you could almost hear it, the soft steps of a man walking not ahead this time, but among them, alongside them, no longer alone. Because his silence had become their promise. And now, the world kept it. He didn't ask for medals. He never stood on a stage. And he never raised his voice. But his silence spoke louder than any speech. Because through one quiet life, he taught a generation how to listen, how to remember, and how to carry forward a promise that was never theirs, but is now ours. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in it, or someone you love, tell us in the comments who is the quiet hero in your life. Don't forget to subscribe to Flow Story for more powerful true stories that remind us sometimes the ones we overlook are the ones who change everything. Until next time, listen deeply, live gently, and never forget the silent ones.